coming out. Obviously, you're here for either a nostalgic view, look back at action figures, or you are currently a collector of action figures, or maybe somewhere in the middle. Had a little then, had a little now, or maybe you're planning on getting into them. Either way, this presentation is for you. Thank you all for coming out. We here are, you see here, it says Sarlacc Presents. We are all members of a local collecting club, and we put this panel together for you this week. Obviously, Sarlacc here is a Star Wars reference, but we've changed the meaning of it to mean Seattle Area Lucasfilm Artifact Collector Club. And this is founded back in '94. Gus Lopez, one of the founding members here. You'll meet them here soon. And yeah, it's one of the oldest collecting clubs in the United States. We also are another group that we meet every, was it last Tuesday of every month, I believe, at Red Robin in Tukwila, South Center here locally. And that's just a little get-together because Sarlacc doesn't do things regularly, but Stars does. So that's the Seattle-Tacoma area Rebel Scummers. We say that because we all met through Rebel Scum forums. So that's an open invite to anyone here that likes what they hear and likes to collect action figures. Come on down to South Center. Last Tuesday, Red Robin is usually where we hang out. So we can come chat, trade stories, figures, all sorts of fun stuff. But what we're going to do now is introduce your panel that's going to walk you through the history of action figures.
So my name is Ryan Beise, and I actually did a very similar panel to this back at Celebration 6 last year. At the time I did this with Matt Fox, and I think we called this Collect All 2,877, I think was the number we had at the time. I've checked now, and the number is about 3,188 now. So that 3,000 question mark was because we weren't sure where it was going to be by the time we did this. I've been a longtime member of Sarlacc since about 95, 96, I think it was. I am considered a completist collector as far as action figures. I pretty much have every figure that they've made, produced regularly. Right now my collection is about 13,000 action figures. And all I do like dioramas and character collections, and I have a bit of a Vader focus with artwork and stuff like that. I guess me.
Hi, my name is Chris Bortz. I've been collecting action figures since 1995. And I found a website called Jedi Business, which is a Star Wars action figure archive. So you can go there, you can pull up figures by their character names, by what movie scenes they were in, what toy lines they were released in, by what year, and so on. And we also have a podcast going. It's called the Galaxy of Toys podcast, and I'm co-hosting that as well. So.
Oh yeah, I forgot Galaxy of Toys. Jason wanted to mention that about 20 times, is that right? Yeah. If you've ever listened to Galaxy of Toys podcast, both Chris and I are on it, and then I know Tom's out there in the audience, and I think Jason's out here as well. So.
My name is Gus Lopez, and I've been collecting Star Wars for a long time. I started picking up the action figures in 1978 when they were first released. I created the Star Wars Collectors Archive, it says here. In 1994, it was the first collecting website on Star Wars collecting website on the internet, and I've also co-authored 4 books on Star Wars collecting, and you know, big fan of particularly the vintage Star Wars action figures.
Perfect. That leaves me. My name's Jake Stevens. I created a website called From Forlam to Zuckus, pretty much just showing my love for action figures. So new and old, I have a lifelong collector of action figures, near complete on Star Wars, dabble in other lines as well, G.I. Joe, He-Man, Transformers, you name it. And yeah, I help out from time to time with Galaxy of Toys podcast as well. So that's your panel. Now, a quick 101, take you to the Jedi Academy, if you will. Of course, Star Wars action figures began back in 1977. Melloway, actually, I offer in 1976, but it was with a company called Kenner, and this was a Cincinnati-based company, obviously, and it kind of pioneered the 3 3/4 phase, which is a very popular line now. I know it's starting to move to a more of a 6-inch focus in modern action figures, but for a long, long time, G.I. Joe and many other lines have adopted this 3 3/4, and we have Kenner to thank for that. Also, we all know that vintage Star Wars action figures were everywhere back in the day. They made them in boatloads, and so they definitely, for a lot of us, Star Wars is not just the movies, but it's also the toys, and that's Kenner as well. And then, of course, later on, Star Wars dies out for a while, but then Hasbro, a Rhode Island-based company, picks up the Star Wars license in '91, or actually purchases Kenner, I should say, in '91, and then revives the action figures in 1995. Now these, of course, are nowhere near as valuable as the vintage ones, but there are about 1,000 more options that you have for figures that were never produced originally. So what is vintage? What is modern? It's kind of more or less anything made by Kenner, which was between the years of '77 to 1990. Well, Kenner didn't make them until 1990, but pretty much the era of vintage goes to about then. And then vintage also, like I said, provided lots of them, but they've held their value and they seem to go up every single year. Now modern toy line kind of revamped itself in '92 when people became more interested in Star Wars. Heir to the Empire, we have to thank to that. And now these figures, again, of course, again, like I just said, are less valuable, but they have been created based on the big media pushes that have been put out the last few years, such as the special edition in '97's, the prequel trilogy, the Clone Wars cartoon, and of course coming the sequel trilogy as well. Now here's a pretty clear breakdown of what the different variation, or what the difference between a vintage and a modern figure is, and we call these POAs, points of articulations. Now I took a Luke Jedi here, or Luke X-Wing here, and it shows you, breaks down the common vintage figure had about 5 points of articulation. So 5 POA. Now the modern one has anywhere between, what is this here? I think it says 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15 here, all the way up to over 20 on some figures. All right, that's going to lead us into Gus. He's going to take you down memory lane with the vintage.
So the Star Wars action figures actually didn't start the first year that Star Wars came out. So Star Wars came out in May 1977. And Kenner, even though they had secured the license before that, was taken by surprise, as was 20th Century Fox, Lucasfilm, and George Lucas. No one really expected Star Wars toys, the Star Wars movie to take off and Star Wars toys to take off. And so because the toy industry is so much based on planning what toys you're going to come out with around Christmas time, they had completely missed it for that year. So Kenner came up with this idea of the early bird certificate. They saw that Star Wars by summer was this amazing smash success, and they wanted to have toys in the stores as quickly as possible, but to miss the Christmas season was like a big disaster. So Kenner executive came up with this idea of, let's sell the idea of kids opening up a piece of cardboard on Christmas Day, and then they'll get a little certificate to wait for the figures in the spring when they finally come out. And so actually, as a ploy to kind of sell lots of action figures, it was very unsuccessful. It actually didn't do very well that season, but it was a very creative idea and really introduced the concept of the action figures and contributed to the very big pent-up interest in the Star Wars action figures. But the figures didn't come out in the US until 1978. Elsewhere in the world, they also started coming around at that time. The first action figures were referred to as the 12-back action figures. So you see on the right side an image of the back of the card back of the action figures. And the reason they're called 12 backs is it shows the 12 different action figures of the original release. So collectors very commonly refer to them as 12 backs. And they had a lot of the main characters of the story, although some more obscure ones like Death Squad Commander. But it was the first cut of the action figures of a line that they would continue to expand upon in the years. And so collectors today, of course, try to find these loose or find them in original package. They're getting increasingly more difficult to find. To find them in great condition is an extremely challenging prospect. But this is something that's highly sought after by collectors today. Back in the day, almost nobody saved these things. So like, I didn't save them, lots of collectors I know didn't save them. Those of us who have these things, it's because we went back and tried to find them. And you can still find them today, but it's very popular with vintage collectors. Very early in the Star Wars line, they actually had variations of action figures. So action figure variations are common today with the Hasbro line, but they actually started as early as 1978. One of the first ones was the Jawa figure. So in early photography, you see the Jawa featured with a vinyl cape, and they decided for the aesthetic reasons, and they were going to switch to a cloth cape. So the very first run of the Jawas had this vinyl cape. So an extremely rare variation. extremely high in demand today, and so it was one of the first. There were actually other variations from the very first 12 figures, but this is one of the most well-known because it was featured in a lot of photography and noticed by some kids. As the kind of action figure line continued, there was demand for going beyond the 12 figures, and so the first introduction of figures beyond the 12 was the Cantina Adventure set. So that was introduced by Sears. In the day, Sears was king as far as toys. So a lot of toys were purchased by parents for their kids through the Sears catalog, particularly the Christmas catalog. And so what Sears was able to do is negotiate a deal with Kenner to do an exclusive playset, the Cantina Adventure set, that had 4 new figures from the action figure line. So there was Greedo, Walrus Man, Hammerhead, and Snaggletooth. But what happened was that the Snaggletooth figure in this playset was this taller Snaggletooth dressed in blue, that when the figure finally came out to be sold in stores, it was changed. It was a smaller figure in red. So it was a very significant variation, only available by mail order from Sears. This is, again, contributing to one of the earliest rare figures from the line. Also during this era, first couple of years of Star Wars, they had these 3-packs. And in the time, I remember almost nobody I knew bought these things. They were, generally anybody who was buying the toys was buying them as the first time you found them, which would generally be on an individual card. But they would, usually after the initial release of a figure, they would bundle a few of them together in a 3-pack. Of course, today, since no one saved these things and the few that were saved were opened, these are extremely sought after, very limited. There's 16 different 3-packs. They made a bunch for A New Hope and then for Empire Strikes Back later on. Very difficult set to put together. I think there's maybe like 1 or 2 full sets in the world if anybody's put together 3-pack sets. So extremely rare. Even finding one of these things is a very tough prospect. Around late 1978, Kenner started to kind of think about more figures to add to the line, and also think about the upcoming Star Wars sequel, Empire Strikes Back. And so they wanted to do a tie-in with Empire Strikes Back, and so they did a mail-away offer for a Boba Fett action figure. So Boba Fett was featured in the holiday special in 1978, so kids would get exposure to the character from the holiday special. And they did this mail-away for this character from Empire Strikes Back. What they advertised was the rocket firing mechanism on Boba Fett action figure. They said, like, let's have a cool new feature, particularly about a character no one really knew about yet before the mystique of Boba Fett set in. And through safety tests, and also at the same time, Mattel had a safety issue with a Battlestar Galactica toy. Kenner decided to change this toy and not have a rocket firing mechanism. They had tried 2 different approaches to the rocket-firing Boba Fett. You see 2 different ones here. These are prototypes of the rocket-firing Boba Fett. But the ones they mailed kids ended up not having the rocket-fire mechanism. So for collectors, this is frequently thought of as the holy grail of action figure collecting is the rocket-firing Boba Fett, because it was so well publicized, so widely known at the time, and yet never released to the public. There were also different scales of action figures. Kenner experimented with a lot of different stuff for around the late 70s. They were doing large-size action figures. By the time of Empire Strikes Back, they got to 12 figures in the set. And they were at different scales, amazingly detailed, arguably better than the large-size action figures that they released years later. These were actually not a huge success. The small action figures were such a runaway success that they were cannibalizing sales of these big figures. These larger figures are more based on the contemporary notions of action figures. So you had things like G.I. Joe, which were large scale at the time, Amigo action figures, which are 8-inch scale. So Kenner wanted to make sure to continue that. They had done $6 Million Man action figures in this scale, and turned out to be kind of a flop for Star Wars. But they were experimenting with different scales of action figures. So by the time Empire Strikes Back comes around, Kenner wasn't sure how much to bet on this, and so while Star Wars was amazingly successful, nobody really knew how Empire Strikes Back would do. It could be a big flop. They could produce all these toys and no one would buy them. So they were still kind of hedging their bets. When they released the initial wave of Empire Strikes Back action figures, they only released 10 figures. Star Wars took it up to 21 figures in the line, and Empire Strikes Back took it to 31. So the 31 backs were the first Empire Strikes Back action figures. But these, again, were runaway success, and they continued then with the 41 backs, the 45 backs, the 47 backs, the 48 backs. They continued releasing more figures in the Empire Strikes Back line. And it took till Return of the Jedi that they finally caught on, like, let's make a lot of figures when the film was out. Empire Strikes Back also introduced the idea of different photo variations on the packaging. So In this example, you see Luke Bespin. They had an initial run on the 31 backs with the photo on the left, and then they switched to the photo on the right by the time they got to 32 backs. So they had different photos. So some collectors try to get the different cards that they introduced. There are also figure variations. So the Luke on the left has yellow hair, the Luke on the right has brown hair, and so collectors get extremely nuanced in these variations and ultimately make the call for themselves, like how significant is that variation? Is that something I really want to collect? Empire also continued with the department store exclusive playsets. So the Cloud City playset, the Rebel Command Center playsets were Sears and JCPenney exclusive playsets that also were bundled with figures. They introduced new figures that weren't available on card yet. There were also playsets you could only buy from these retailers. So now by Return of the Jedi, Kenner kind of caught on. So they had finished Empire Strikes Back line with 48 figures, and now they released the initial wave of Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi action figures was 65. So they added 17 in the first wave. So they were just going to go just release with tons of figures. By the second wave, they went to 77. So they added 12 more. So they made sure they were ready for that initial release. Collectors continue to call these things like 65 backs, 77 backs, and so on, because Kenner did an unusual thing. As they released new figures, they continued keeping all of the figures in the lineup and all of the figures on the card backs. Today, it's very rare to do that with any action figure line. Most of the time, they only show the current releases and then swap out the ones that are featured on the card backs. But Kenner did this thing all through the release of the vintage action figures, so that you kept accumulating more and more figures. And kids use these as checklists. It was a very convenient thing at the time. Another interesting thing on the 65 backs you see on the right, you see two figures are kind of blacked out on this, and those are two of the Ewok figures. So in the very first wave of the Return of the Jedi figures, Kenner was actually hiding the Ewoks to keep it like, I guess they thought it would be a great surprise. And then in the next wave they started to show the Ewoks on the card backs, but they were part of the initial release, but they kept it as a surprise for people to discover in the movie. There were also some multi-packs from Return of the Jedi. They're not as rare or sought after as the 3-packs from the first two movies, but Kenner had a bunch of these 2-packs where they, on the left, where they just took two random figures, bundled them together, and it was really random. Like they might have no accessories, they might have the wrong accessories, they might have, it was completely random. And for many, many years, collectors could care less about the 2-packs because it was just pretty much a random assortment of figures. And now there are collectors trying to find every variation, every combination of 2-packs, because there are hundreds of combinations. If you can imagine two of each of the 77 figures through that time, gives you quite a few different options of bundling. There's also a Rebo Band 3-pack. The only way you could get the Max Rebo Band was this 3-pack set that was sold in stores that came with the instruments and the Max Rebo Band. After Return of the Jedi had released in the movie theaters and interest in Star Wars was starting to wane, Kenner wanted to keep the Star Wars license alive, and so they released this series called Power of the Force. The idea was use a brand, Power of the Force, that would kind of encompass all three of those films, and you could then release figures from all 3 movies. One of the also interesting things they did with this is they bundled these things with coins. So they had these coins that were featured, go back to the previous slide, you see kind of on the card, and you could get the coin with each character, or you could mail away for coins. So on the card backs, you could send off proofs of purchase and get some of the coins. And some of the coins you could only get through mail away. And it turned out so few people by this time were collecting or buying these toys that the mail away coins were exceptionally rare. And full sets of the 62 coins are just, nobody had them at the time because nobody thought to mail away for them. But Kenner actually even offered the opportunity for people to buy a full set. You could buy a full set for something like $20 at the time, and very few people took them up on it. By the time the Star Wars action figure line was dying out, and this is like circa 85, they were going to release the 93 backs and introduce a new character called Yak Face. Yak Face was never released in the United States. He would have added him to the 92 figure lineup to be 93. They were also going to have a coin album, so that as you were collecting these coins, you could put them in this album that's featured here. And all of this was, all the stuff pictured here are prototypes of what would have happened had Kenner continued with the original movie action figure line. But by this time, Star Wars interest was so dead that they cut it off and decided to shift away from the movie line of action figures and go towards the animated Star Wars series. So at the time, mid-80s, Lucasfilm was working with Kenner on the Droids series action figures. So Droids was a cartoon, Saturday morning cartoon featuring R2-D2 and 3PO and various characters from the Star Wars universe, like Boba Fett, A-Wing Pilot, folks like that, IG-88. And so what they were doing is releasing some of the same figures from the original action figure line and other sort of cartoon likenesses. And these figures also had coins. These came with gold-colored coins. And they were based on that cartoon series. It turned out that they only got to 12 figures from the series, and they had planned a second wave, but the Droids cartoon really wasn't that much of a success, and so the next 8 action figures never made it to market. So what you see here are characters that were planned for that release, never made it to market, and are examples of very rare prototypes of that second wave of action figures from Droids. One of the figures you see here, the one on the right, Vlix, was actually released. So in Brazil, in the late 1980s, there was a company called Glaslite that licensed through Kenner the ability to sell Star Wars action figures. And Glaslite released Vlix in Brazil around circa 80. And so this is an example of Vlix on the card that was actually taken to market. So only in Brazil. Again, you can imagine how few of these things survive to this day. Also around that time, contemporary with Droids was the Ewoks cartoon. Also, running in theaters, the first release, running on TV shows, 6 action figures from the initial release. Also not a big success story. Only those 6 were ever released to market. They also had a second wave of figures similar to Droids. These 6 were never released to market. So this is, again, you see the theme, like Power of the Force series, took it to market, cut it off, then Droids, then Ewoks. Interest in StarArs was waning. You were getting to a period where just kids had moved on to other licenses, other toys. In Europe, they had a bunch of action figures, some of them ones not released in the United States, that are known by collectors as Tri-Logo action figures. And the reason they're called Tri-Logo is they had the Star Wars Return of the Jedi logo in 3 different languages, and the idea was one common packaging you could sell all over Europe. And then figures like Yakface and Anakin that were not sold on card in the United States were offered in Europe. Now, a little known fact about the Tri-Logo figures, they actually were sold in the US as well. Even though they were designed for the European market, eventually in Europe, they got saturated with Star Wars as well, and they started to discount and close out a lot of the remaining action figures at KB stores in the United States. So in the late 80s, it was actually possible to buy Yakface, Anakin, and all the other Tri-Logo action figures in the United States. But the Tri-Logo figures and the Brazilian figures are really considered the end of the vintage line, which kind of wrapped up by the late 80s. And so at this point, we'll hand off to Ryan.
So here we have the only set of figures not done by Hasbro or Kenner. We have the Bendham's line. I don't know how many people actually remember these things. Yeah. Somehow I became the champion of this on the Galaxy of Toys podcast because I have them, I guess. But here we have the Luke Skywalker Bendham's. If you've seen these in person, they're terrible. They look awful. But again, back in '94, we had no Star Wars stuff to buy. I mean, there was Bendham's, there was Micro Machines. This is what we got, and then applause came. Those weren't much better. But so we see Luke here in all his glory. We don't know how many points of articulation he has. It has a little bendy rod inside, so yeah. At least Luke looks okay. Some of these, like the Han Solo and the Princess Leia, look absolutely awful. But in 1995, we got Star Wars figures back, and here we have Luke Skywalker. They started off with this red-orange card with the Darth Vader on the corner. There was a total of 114 figures done in this style of what we consider Power of the Force 2, which ran all the way up to about 2000, which was a little bit into the area of Episode 1. Now, the funny thing is, I don't know how many of you remember in '95 buying these figures and looking at them and thinking they were working out somewhere. Or here we have our He-Man Luke. He only has 6 points of articulation, which is one more than the vintage figures in that he has his waist joint on these. And for most of the Power of the Force line, it continued with the 6 points of articulation until toward the end, when they got toward Power of the Jedi, they started adding things in there. In 1996, there was a multimedia event called Shadows of the Empire that involved not only a book, but actually a soundtrack for the book, a video game, Micro Machines, as well as an action figure line. I said there's 5 figures in this line because there's only 5 figures on a Shadows of the Empire card, but Leia Bosch and Han and Carbonite were released in the same wave as well with that. Again, same points of articulation, still kind of bulked up, still working out in that wave room. And this is the Luke of the Coruscant guard disguise, which is something we've never seen redone or at all, very different looking figure. And also, these started a hologram sticker on the card, which you can see over there, instead of just a picture as a hologram, which moved over to the Power of the Force line eventually. There are some that had regular pictures, some had holograms. Eventually, in '97, we started to get these green cards. This is the time the Star Wars Special Editions were hitting early in the year. As you can see, also has the hologram. You will see some green cards out there with just a picture and not a hologram, but they're still kind of bulky. They're starting to slim down a little bit, but I mean, like the basic mold here on Luke is the same as the original Stormtrooper, so he's still going to be beefed up a little bit. As you can see, still same 6 points of articulation. A little less bulky, yes, but this is our first time seeing a Luke and Stormtrooper disguise since Power of the Force. Also, I didn't put it in here, but they released the Han Solo and Stormtrooper disguise as a Fruit Loops mail-away offer. You had to send in your first purchases and so much money, and you could get your Han Solo and Stormtrooper disguise from Fruit Loops, which was the first time that figure was ever done. Moving on, in 1998, we got what we call the freeze frame line, which is because they came with that little freeze frame that you see on the card. It was a removable deal that you could stick in. It was kind of like a slide that you put a slide projector, if you remember what those are. And they actually did some slide projector type things for this. They had like a little deal that looked like Han's binoculars on Hoth that you could put the little slides into and look at it when you held them up to the light and stuff like that. Again, we still have 6 points of articulation. This Luke technically has 7 because his right arm, or right hand was removable. And in such, the hand would move back and forth at the wrist. So he added an extra piece there. And we had our first wave then of expanded universe. We had several figures, mostly from Dark Empire. This is the Dark Empire Luke here. Dark Empire, is that right? Yeah, okay. The unique thing about these is they did add a piece of articulation, but the card backs would actually, you could cut off this piece, they were really thick, and it would fold out into a diorama, as you can see in the picture there. It has a little diorama for Luke to stand in this cardboard. The figures themselves started, again, adding points of articulation. This Luke had both wrists that were articulated, as well as what we'd previously seen. Then we got into toward the episode 1, where we were all excited to see a new Star Wars movie coming out. And in 1999, we got what was called the flashbacks. And they had previews of episode 1 figures. If you look at that little flashback deal on the card, you could pull down on that. You could even pull it down on the card, and it would show a character from episode 1. In this case, I think with Luke, you pulled it down, you saw Anakin Skywalker. And again, we started to see more points of articulation. All of a sudden, Luke here has elbow joints. So he has a total of 10 points of articulation, as well as the flashback. And along with episode 1, we started to see Comtech. If you remember your Comtech readers, they were a little device that said, now your figures can talk. And you put this little Comtech over the device and it would talk, not in a movie voice, but whatever Hasbro employee recorded the movie dialogue. And they did this with both episode 1 as well as these figures. These ran from 1999 to 2000. And again, we see 10 points of articulation on him, not because of elbows this time, but actual knees. And we have the episode 1 figures, which glutted the market quite a bit, if you remember. From 99 to 2000, again, Comtech chips, same idea. Various articulation. We saw lots of different points of articulation on these. This Anakin here only has 5, but there were figures that had elbow joints, or figures that had wrist joints, and again, came with Comtech chips. I think I hand this over to Chris now.
After episode 1 came, How the Jedi ran for about 2 years, from 2000 till 2002. We got 60 single carded figures in this series, and it's the first time that Hasbro unified the original trilogy with prequel characters. And when you take a look at the card back, on the top left corner, you see the original trilogy, Darth Vader in the background, and a prequel, young Obi-Wan Kenobi in the foreground. Every Beise action figure, except for the last 9 figures, contained a Jedi Force file, which was a little booklet which contained more information about the character. For example, it contained a biography, what adventures the character had been in, allies to enemies, vital stats, and so on. And it was basically a way for Hasbro to introduce the original trilogy and some of the characters to a new audience. Because if you keep in mind that Power of the Jedi had just come out 1 year after Episode 1 had come out, and that drew in a whole lot of new collectors, meaning kids and children. Power of the Jedi was popular among collectors for various reasons. Hasbro managed to strike a good balance of updated and new sculpts. They released a lot of background aliens, especially from the Cantina scene. We got a really cool Rebel Trooper, which was fantastic because the one that they released before was the Power of the Force 2 series, and it was like very He-Man-like, very bulky looking. And so if you look at the figure on the left-hand side, it was much more realistic looking at this point. And we also got a Boshek figure, which only appeared on screen for a few seconds, and we got Shmi Skywalker, which is also fantastic. Towards the end of the line of the Power of the Jedi, we got 4 sneak preview figures for Attack of the Clones. The packaging design already gave us a look ahead of what was to come with the bigger bubble, and this was also the very first Clone Trooper action figure which Hasbro has ever released. And then we got Star Wars Saga, which ran from 2002 until about 2004, and we got the second Midnight Madness event. Have any of you guys ever been to a Midnight Madness here in Seattle? Some of you guys. Back in 2002, I went to Northgate to Toys R Us. It's pretty cool to go out at about midnight and look at new Star Wars toys. The 501st was there. They were walking up and down the streets with the stormtroopers. So it was a fun event.
I was also there, but I was on the other side of the counter selling the toys and toys.
We got 129 single carded figures. Again, it was a unified look, and Hasbro decided to not go ahead and use a dedicated toy line for Attack of the Clones. So those card backs don't say Attack of the Clones anywhere on them. When Attack of the Clones came out, there was a heavy focus on Attack of the Clones action figures, but they had also managed to move in original trilogy figures. So if you went to see Attack of the Clones on day 1 in movie theaters, and then after that you went to a Fred Meyer store or Toys R Us to look at Star Wars figures, there was a very good chance that you would also find a Darth Vader mixed in. And Hasbro underestimated the demand for clone troopers. We only got 2 clone troopers throughout the entire year. It took them until the end of 2003 to come out with more clones. The bubble was much bigger, which was fantastic for fans because now Hasbro had a chance to include bigger figures and more accessories, such as the stands. We got some really cool display stands with some of the figures. For example, the Tusken Raider on the left came with a little Tatooine base, which had a little fire pit next to him. And Padme came with a base which looked as if she was kind of standing right next to the Lars homestead. Most of the figures during the Star Wars Saga line had action poses and action features. Some of the figures had blast effects, so you can take a blast effect and attach it to the lightsaber, so it would kind of look like as if the Jedi would deflect the lightsaber blast. Some of the Jedi had magnets in their hands, so they could kind of force attract the lightsaber hilt. Didn't work that well, but it was a nice try on Hasbro's behalf. And then during the Star Wars Saga series, we got the Clone Wars Tartakovsky micro-series on TV. And in order to support that, Hasbro released a realistic-looking toy line and an animated toy line as well. Here you're looking at the realistic series, and those figures don't necessarily look exactly the way they appeared in the cartoon series. But Hasbro went ahead and they used the designs from some of the comic books for that. And then we got into the anime. Not quite. Oh yeah, that's right. During the Clone Wars series, we got the term superposable, and Hasbro somehow shot themselves in the foot with that because this clone trooper was so fantastic. It had 14 points of articulation, which no other figure had before. And from this point on, pretty much, we wanted to have all of our figures to have 14 points of articulation. And they were finally able to release more clone troopers as well. And so here's the animated toy line. If you look at the figures, they looked exactly like the characters in the TV show. They were totally focused on the children. They had very limited articulation, so you could bang them around and none of the joints would pop off. And they only released 14 figures in this series. And then we move into the original trilogy, which came out at the end of 2004 to support the release of the original trilogy on DVD. We got 38 single carded figures. And when you look at the card back, you can clearly see how it was inspired by the original vintage figures from the 70s and the 80s with the double border going all around. And Hasbro also included bases and stands with the figures again. The original trilogy collection was basically repacks and repaints of previously released action figures, which was kind of boring. But there were some highlights in the series, such as the blue Snaggletooth, which was the first time that Hasbro released a blue modern Snaggletooth, which is a tribute to the original Sears Kenner figure from back in the days. A subline from the original trilogy was the vintage original trilogy collection, and here Hasbro mimicked exactly the card back from the 70s and the 80s. But the figures that they released were super articulated, meaning about 12 to 14 points of articulation. They were highly detailed. We got 12 figures total, and the special thing that Hasbro did was they mailed these out to the stores in clamshells so that collectors could get their hands on these card backs in mint condition. At the beginning of 2005, we got the post-original trilogy collection, which only had 16 figures. It was a transitional series leading into the Revenge of the Sith. The card back stayed almost unchanged from the original trilogy collection, except for they removed the logo at the bottom that said original trilogy collection. So now that they could include episode 1 figures and episode 2 figures as well. And then we got to the Revenge of the Sith in 2005. It was a dedicated toy line. So almost through entire 2005, all we got was action figures based on Revenge of the Sith. And Hasbro also, together with Toys R Us and also Walmart at the time, did the third Midnight Madness event. And we got 75 single carded figures in the series, and it was a mix of collector-focused figures and children-friendly action features. So some of the figures would have a feature where you could squeeze the legs together and then the right arm would go up, the left arm would go up, which was clearly for kids. But they also released some very nicely detailed action figures, such as this Anakin Skywalker here, which is all burned up and very detailed looking. Hasbro released the Early Bird Kit in 2005, which was a tribute to the vintage collectors. They did the same thing. They released the cardboard backdrop, and then you had to mail away for your figures. And then a few months later, the figures arrived in your mailbox, and the 4 figures included in the set was an updated Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, R2, and Chewbacca. The nice thing here is definitely Luke, because with his telescoping lightsaber, he's clearly a tribute to the original vintage figure from the 1970s. And with the Revenge of the Sith, we also got more bases with the basic figures. And then we get into 2006 with the Saga collection. And the nice thing here was, again, that Hasbro released action figures from all 6 movies. And it was nice because 2005 was all about prequels, was all about 2005's Revenge of the Sith release. So for this series, Hasbro did a couple of things. They released multiple sublines, such as the Greatest Battles, and the Heroes and Villains, and again, the vintage figures. They also released 10 Ultimate Galactic Hunt figures, which were chase figures. The only difference was the packaging. The packaging had a silver logo on the top, and it also included a silver display stand, and it came with a silver figurine. Every other basic action figure had either a blue or a red hologram, and a display stand, a regular display stand included. And that gets us to the 30th anniversary collection in 2007, 30 years of the original Star Wars movie. We got 64 single carded figures. Instead of just celebrating the original Star Wars, Hasbro went ahead and they said, we want to celebrate all of Star Wars, meaning not just the movies, but also the Clone Wars, the expanded universe, such as the comic books, the novels, some deleted scenes. Let's do some concept designs, and also video games. And the very first figure Hasbro released was Darth Vader, and it was bundled together with a coin album. And each Beise action figure in the series contained a coin which you could collect. And there's also chase figures, so you could get a gold coin or a black coin as well. And the last thing I want to point out is the Rolf McQuarrie subset, which is truly fantastic because if you've grown up with the original Star Wars movie, then you're very familiar with Rolf McQuarrie's artwork. And Hasbro managed to release a whole bunch of figures based on Rolf McQuarrie's design. And I think the anniversary collection is probably one of the coolest and best Star Wars toy lines that we've gotten so far. And this goes to Jeff now.
Is a whole new media focus for Star Wars, and that's the Clone Wars. A new cartoon came out, just ended here, just these last few months. So it ran 6 seasons, but this is the action figure line that's going to become the focus of Star Wars for the next few years. This debuted just before the movie did, which was in October, so these would have come out around July. And these did not have any pack-ins, like you saw coins and Comtech chips. This had nothing, but it did have, if you notice that little Clone Troopers sticker on the left, this was the new chase to find that sticker. I know, really exciting, but no. They had a handful of chase figures in this line. Now what they did is they mirrored the non-Clone Wars based line for the normal series that they had that advertised, that would sell the original trilogy figures. This too had the chase figures, but more importantly about this line, it introduced a fan favorite pack-in called Build-A-Droids. Okay, so the Build-A-Droids, where for every new figure you bought, you got a piece of a droid. You buy all the new figures, you get all the new droids. So more or less it was adding a bonus droid every couple of figures you bought. They had Astromechs and Protocols. All right, the Legacy collection also included a few sublines. The Greatest Hits line was a few reissues. It's a line of whopping 4 figures. And then the other one was a Saga Legends line that included these little lockers that you would open up and it would have weapons inside. So there's about 27 figures. Most of these are all reissues as well. So these were good for kids to pick up. Collectors kind of ignored them since they already had these figures. This here, the Peg Warmer Award winner goes to this lovely Java dancing gal, Yarna. She was, yeah, I know, give her a round of applause, folks. She stuck it out for a long time. Released in 2008, she was still found on pegs in certain places for a whopping $2.48 in January 2014.
Wasn't that Tacoma Toys R Us?
This is, yes, my Toys R Us, where I took this picture just a month or 2 ago. So yeah, she is probably one of the least desired figures. She has 6 boobs, I don't know why, but all right. The Clone Wars gets a package change. It turns to red now. It also included way more figures in this line. Still no pack-ins. It's got some play features though. I wanted to point out another great, if you're into Star Wars action figures, another great website, friend of mine, StarWarsCollector.com. If you want high-res photos of carded figures, this is a great one to go to. Legacy Collection follows this up in 2009. Here, the lines become unified again. So each different line is just going to have simply different colors, same type of card. Still have Build-A-Droids. Fans are very happy about that. You buy a figure, you get a part. There's a bunch of parts on the left for the droids, factory Build-A-Droids, and then on the right, they redesigned the Clone Locker just slightly. And those are all reissues for the Saga Legends line. Sorry, I'm blowing through it so I can get some questions from you guys here. Then the Clone Wars, about Season 3, takes a darker turn, and the action figure line supports that. Here the line expands massively. We get 65 carded figures alone. The line reaches its zenith. This is the biggest it will get. From here on out, it's going to be downhill. This is the Saga side. See, again, they have the same type of card shape, but here this is going to be for figures that are from everything outside of the Clone Wars. This introduces also the new pack-in. This is a game that they tried to get popular with kids. You would buy these little cards, they would slide into these gray bases up there at the top, and it would reveal that character's power. You can see there's different combinations of bases, so they would have different powers depending on who you slid in. It didn't really take off with kids or collectors, but there are tons of these cards out there. Then this is probably the fans' favorite modern line. It's the vintage collection. They more or less mimicked exactly what Kenner did back in the day on the front of the card. On the front of the card, they produced a huge consecutive line with over 100 figures. I think they tapped out at 116, 115, somewhere around there. This is an example of the card back that they eventually went to. So they even tried making the back just like Kenner. You see the vintage on the left, Hasbro's is on the right. They're very close. Clone Wars still continues. Now this line, though, a couple years ago, The Phantom Menace came out in 3D in theaters. So they thought it was going to be a huge resurgence of Star Wars, so they made lots of figures. Well, they were wrong. People went to see it, they went, we've seen it before, and no one bought the toys. They clogged up the market. It became a rough time for Star Wars collectors. This is a very small line. You can see, last Clone Wars line they did 65, now we have 18. So here sees the end of the Clone Wars in the future. Movie Heroes was the non-Clone Wars side of this line, and it was meant to be the official tie-in as well to The Phantom Menace. This is the official line. Again, it's still doing the Galactic Battle game cards with different color bases, slightly different cards. Still not that exciting, never really caught on. Attack of the Clones, did you guys go see it in 3D? No, we didn't, because they canceled it when Disney took ownership of, when Disney bought Lucasfilm, they canceled Attack of the Clones in 3D because they want us to focus on the original trilogy and not the prequel. So they pulled that. Well, it takes about a year for Hasbro to crank out figures. So to do so, they already had these figures in the pipe. They already had the card back to design to tie into this movie that was never released. So this line became very scarce. It was released only outside of the United States. It's a very rare line now. It's very difficult to find. It's very expensive. It's only 9 figures. The same thing with these ones here. The Clone Wars and the original tie-ins, both of them, very hard to find, not released in America. This brings us to 2013. We get 2 new lines so far. This one here, very controversial. Why? It takes figures back to 5 points of articulation. Gone are the super articulated figures for this line. We are now here, also with a card back that ties into Revenge of the Sith in 3D, which of course never came out as well. And then the current collector-based line, it's the Black Series. This is meant to kind of get some figures that were already planned out to people, and it's kind of a stopgap until we get the next films, which of course, before the films, we're getting an animated series this fall from Disney. It's called Rebels. Looks very exciting. Takes place 4 years before A New Hope, and it is all based about the Rebels and the Imperials, and this is the packaging design for them already that they've shown. And then what's the future? We are got lots of figures in your future. If you're a collector, there's no end in sight, because we have episode 7 next year. We got a spin-off film promised, then episode 8, then another spin-off film, then episode 9. So I jokingly put on, we'll see you, collect all 4,000 in 2020.
I think we'll hit 4,000 more earlier than that.
Probably. Yeah. I agree. Okay, questions, answers. We got 5 minutes. Love to hear from you. We got a microphone over here. Help me out, go on over here.
That was a really good presentation. Thank you. In the beginning, I saw the 3 packs. When were those sold and how much? I've never seen them.
They were starting to sell it, I think it was either late 78 or early 79 is when they first started, and it continued till about 81, 82 with Empire Strikes Back. Some of them were offered through department stores, but they were available even at Toys R Us, so they were available at multiple retailers. They were extremely difficult to find even then, and only certain retailers carried.
How much have you guys seen before? I mean, I've never seen it.
Some have sold as high as $7,000 to $8,000 for one. I'll give you an idea.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
It's also important to note that everything featured in these photos, in this presentation, is from our collections. And that the very rare figures, especially the unproduced, of course, are Gus's possessions as well. So we're lucky.
If you've never checked out his prototype book, I highly recommend it. Sorry, I'm giving you a plug there.
Sir, you have a question?
Yeah, so I was interested to hear a little bit about the department store tie-ins and the role that they had, because it kind of filled in some gaps in my memory. And I remembered when I was little, I really wanted that Boba Fett so bad, and my mom ordered it from Sears like way in advance. And I'll never forget, it came in this weird little brown cardboard nothing. And there was like no label. It was like this black market thing. And you know, you just took off the Scotch tape and there was Boba Fett and that was it. Was that like very common back then?
Yeah, it's a good question. Kenner, a lot of times would try to tease collectors with upcoming figures, either from new movies or new characters in the existing line. Boba Fett was just the first of those. They did it again. They actually did it with Yoda, with Bosk, with Forlom, so a lot of other characters they did this with. But they usually sent it in a generic mailer, not very exciting. At least the Boba Fett one had a little background on the character, so it was a little more interesting than the others. Bosk had some interesting stuff, but most of them, it was just a catalog and a generic mailer. But Kenner continued that ploy for future.
Yeah, Hasbro actually continued that with their mailaways too. They did like little white mailer boxes.
All right, I think we've had our time here, but we want to ask you back. We have some very good friends, Gus included, Ryan included. Our friend Tom here in the audience will be putting on another panel called Touring the Galaxy. This is where they've gone out and they've visited a handful of locations of where Star Wars was actually filmed. So that's going to be taking place tomorrow in room TCC 302 at 2 o'clock. And folks, thank you. May the Force be with you. And enjoy the rest of your time. If there's any